The Phantom Menace wasn't just a comeback, it was a myth rebooted before the world knew how to process digital prophecy. When it roared into theaters in 1999, 16 years had passed since Return of the Jedi closed the original saga. George Lucas returned not with nostalgia, but with political chess disguised as space opera. Beneath the Jar Jar controversy and pod racing spectacle lived visual clues, political breadcrumbs, and symbols that whispered the future of the Skywalker bloodline. These are 20 hidden details you completely missed in The Phantom Menace. Number 1. Instead of rebellion and war, the crawl opens with trade disputes and taxation of routes. The language is intentionally bureaucratic, flattening the fantasy tone audiences expected after 16 years. George Lucas deliberately chose dry political language to signal a tonal shift in the saga. This wasn't heroic rebellion anymore. This was institutional decay filmed in real time. Lucas studied historical accounts of Rome's fall, modeling the Republic's collapse on senatorial paralysis. Screenwriter Jonathan Hales later confirmed the opening was designed to disorient viewers who expected immediate action. The new era opens with paperwork instead of blasters, and that contrast matters. It wasn't an accident or poor writing. It was a warning wrapped in yellow text scrolling against the stars. The galaxy's collapse wouldn't begin with war. It would begin with meetings and signatures nobody bothered to read. Number 2. Naboo is clean, elegant, and classical in design. Production designer Gavin Bouquet deliberately modeled the planet's aesthetic after Renaissance Italy, using marble textures and symmetrical columns throughout every interior. Bouquet and his team studied Venetian palaces and Roman forums to create a visual language of cultural peak. The planet represents a galaxy at its highest point of civilization, art, and refinement. Lucas wanted Naboo to feel like the last breath of something, precious before inevitable collapse. Cinematographer David Tattersall lit every throne room and courtyard with soft golden light to enhance the sense of doomed elegance. It argues visually that when systems this refined fall, the destruction will be total. The coming fall of the Republic feels inevitable because perfection never survives contact with corruption. Number 3. Darth Maul barely speaks and never argues with his master. His entries are framed with low angles and disappearing edits that make him feel like a supernatural threat rather than a character. Lucas gave specific instructions to actor Ray Park and stunt coordinator Nick Gillard. Maul had to move like a predator, not a person. His physicality was modeled after martial artists and big cats, creatures that operate on instinct rather than conversation. Park trained for months in wushu and gymnastics to achieve the inhuman grace Lucas demanded. Ian McDiarmid, who played Palpatine, later revealed that Maul's silence was intentional contrast against the Senator's endless political dialogue. Words seduce the Senate. Maul isn't a character yet in this film. He's a threat waiting for permission to strike, and his silence makes that waiting unbearable. Number 4. The Senate arena dwarfs every senator who speaks. Even Natalie Portman as Padme is swallowed by layers of polished architecture and floating platforms. Production designer Gavin Bouquet deliberately designed the chamber to make individuals feel powerless inside their own government. The set was built as a massive practical construction at Leavesden Studios, one of the largest interior sets ever constructed for a film at that time. Senators float in isolated pods, unable to reach each other, forced to shout across impossible distances. Lucas studied the United Nations General Assembly and European parliamentary chambers, then exaggerated the scale to absurd proportions. Democracy looks grand and sounds reasonable, but it feels completely powerless. When systems grow too large, individual voices disappear into the machinery of process. Number 5. The sequence uses dynamic cutaways, announcer commentary, and pit stop coverage, lifted directly from 1990s racing broadcasts. Editor Paul Martin Smith studied NASCAR and Formula One coverage extensively, analyzing how live sports television builds tension through rapid cuts and multiple camera angles. Lucas wanted the pod race to feel like entertainment inside the universe, not just action for the audience. The two-headed announcer, voiced by Greg Proops and Scott Capurro, delivers play-by-play commentary exactly like ESPN sportscasters calling a live event. Sound designer Ben Burt layered engine roars with crowd reactions recorded at actual racing events to enhance the broadcast authenticity. It's commercial entertainment, commodifying a child's life for spectator pleasure. Anakin's survival is broadcast like Sunday afternoon sports, and the crowd cheers without caring whether he lives or dies. Number 6. Liam Neeson's Qui-Gon is the only Jedi who treats destiny as factual rather than philosophical. The Council treats the prophecy as superstition, ancient text with no practical application. But Qui-Gon speaks about the Chosen One with absolute certainty, showing no hesitation or doubt in his conviction. Neeson said director George Lucas told him to play Qui-Gon as a believer operating on faith, not evidence. The character was modeled partially on wandering monks who follow spiritual conviction over institutional doctrine. Meanwhile, Samuel L. Jackson's Mace Windu dismisses the prophecy entirely entirely, representing the Council's empirical skepticism. It's about whether the Force operates through fate or free will. When institutions stop believing in their own founding myths, they've already begun to crumble from within. Number 7. Padme's royal gowns use rigid silhouettes and heavy makeup to obscure recognition. Costume designer Trisha Bigger created 14 distinct looks for Natalie Portman, each designed to transform her face and body into unrecognizable shapes. The white throne room gown alone weighed over 40 pounds and required 3 assistants to help Portman move between takes. Bigger studied Mongolian headdresses, Japanese ceremonial dress, and Elizabethan court fashion to create costumes that functioned as architectural disguise. Meanwhile, the handmaid in disguise strips away all ornamentation, leaving Portman in simple robes and minimal makeup. Power is performative, constructed through costume and cosmetics rather than inherent authority. When Padme needs to act, she removes the performance and becomes herself. The costumes argue that leadership is theater, and sometimes the most effective move is stepping off the stage entirely. Number 8. Their entire civilization hides in wetlands beneath Naboo's pristine cities. Production designer Gavin Bouquet deliberately created 2 civilizations that share a planet without truly sharing resources, culture, or political power. The Gungans live underwater and underground, invisible to the surface society that profits from their exile. Bouquet said the design was influenced by historical accounts of displaced indigenous populations forced into marginal territories. Ahmed Best, who performed Jar Jar Binks, later noted that the Gungans' storyline was meant to reflect real-world colonization dynamics, though the execution became controversial. Lucas wanted to show 2 peoples occupying the same world in completely different realities. The Naboo ignore the Gungans until they need military assistance, then expect immediate cooperation. It visually mirrors colonialism, apartheid, and economic segregation compressed into fictional geography. Number 9. They hesitate, miscommunicate, and complain throughout every combat sequence. Their programming simulates discomfort more than obedience, making them feel like reluctant soldiers rather than efficient machines. Sound designer Ben Burt gave the droids uncertain vocal patterns, with rising inflections that suggest questions rather than commands. The voices were modeled after customer service workers and bureaucrats, people following instructions without understanding context. Burt recorded actors reading droid lines with intentional confusion and nervous energy. George Lucas wanted automation that felt cheaply made and poorly designed, reflecting the Trade Federation's cost-cutting corporate philosophy. War is mechanized, but never perfectly efficient. The droids fail constantly because they were built by the lowest bidder. Their incompetence isn't accidental comedy, it's commentary on privatized warfare and the dangers of treating soldiers as products rather than people. Number 10. The double-bladed saber wasn't just fan service or visual spectacle. It forces opponents to defend instead of dominate, completely changing lightsaber combat philosophy. Stunt coordinator Nick Gillard choreographed the duel, specifically around the weapon's defensive advantages. Gillard studied Philippine stick fighting and Japanese staff techniques to develop a fighting style that prioritized positioning over aggression. Ray Park trained for 3 months learning the choreography, which required him to spin the weapon in ways that protected his body while forcing opponents backward. Ewan McGregor and Liam Neeson both noted that fighting Maul felt like fighting architecture, not a person. Every move Maul makes limits where his opponents can step, gradually boxing them into smaller defensive positions until they have nowhere left to retreat. Number 11. His manual reactions are faster than the camera can follow during the Podrace sequence. The film silently proves he can handle high-speed, low-margin decisions under impossible pressure without conscious thought. Editor Paul Martin Smith and George Lucas deliberately cut the Podrace to show Anakin reacting before obstacles appear on screen, suggesting precognitive awareness. Jake Lloyd performed against green screen, but his hand movements were timed to match professional racing driver reflexes studied during pre-production. Sound designer Ben Burt layered cockpit audio to emphasize the sensory overload Anakin processes effortlessly. Starfighter dogfights were already in his muscle memory. The Force doesn't just guide him, it accelerates his perception and reaction time to superhuman levels. Number 12. No Republic presence exists on the planet. No Jedi jurisdiction extends to the Outer Rim territories. Slavery persists simply because no one powerful cares enough to intervene or enforce galactic law. Production designer Gavin Bouquet designed Mos Espa to feel like a frontier town abandoned by central authority, using North African architecture and markets as visual reference. The buildings feel ancient, worn, and neglected, suggesting centuries of institutional disinterest. George Lucas deliberately framed Tatooine as the edge of civilization, where Republic values stop mattering because enforcement stops existing. Liam Neeson noted that Qui-Gon's inability to simply free Anakin illustrated the limits of Jedi power outside Republic space. Tatooine isn't poor because it lacks resources. It's poor because the Republic decided it wasn't worth protecting, governing, or even knowing noticing. Number 13, they never define destiny or explain the Force itself. They only measure potential, functioning like spiritual instruments rather than theological explanations. Qui-Gon treats them like weather instruments, tools for observation, not sources of mystical power. Liam Neeson said George Lucas explained midichlorians as a way to quantify something inherently unquantifiable, showing the Jedi's misguided attempt to rationalize faith. The concept was inspired by mitochondria, cellular structures that enable biological function without being the essence of life itself. Lucas wanted to show that even the Jedi don't fully understand the Force. The Force remains mystical and unknowable. Science is just trying to keep up, measuring symptoms without understanding cause. They were never meant to demystify the Force. They were meant to show that quantifying faith is impossible even when you try. Number 14, he manipulates bureaucrats with calm statements and reasonable tones throughout every political scene. The Senate listens because he never sounds dangerous, angry, or threatening. Ian McDiarmid played Senator Palpatine with deliberate softness, using quiet vocal delivery to suggest trustworthiness rather than ambition. McDiarmid studied political speeches from Democratic leaders who rose to power through charm rather than force. George Lucas wanted Palpatine to sound like the most reasonable person in every room he entered. Sound mixer Gary Rydstrom kept McDiarmid's voice low in the mix, forcing audiences to lean in and listen carefully. The audio design makes Palpatine feel intimate and confidential, like he's sharing secrets rather than plotting treason. Evil presented as pragmatism is far more dangerous than evil presented as villainy. Number 15, in council scenes, Frank Oz's Yoda rarely interrupts or offers direct solutions. He only observes, letting debates unfold, without steering them toward decisive action. Oz said George Lucas directed him to play Yoda as someone who sees patterns forming but refuses to force conclusions. The Jedi choose process over action, valuing discussion over intervention even when danger becomes obvious. Samuel L. Jackson noted that the council scenes were intentionally frustrating, showing institutional paralysis disguised as democratic process. Wisdom becomes paralysis when it refuses to choose. The Jedi value procedure so much they've forgotten how to make hard decisions quickly. Yoda watches the Republic crumble because he believes in letting the Force guide events rather than forcing outcomes. Sometimes it's just cowardice dressed in patience. 16. Duel of the Fates is structured like a ritual, not a battle theme. Composer John Williams wrote the piece using Sanskrit lyrics from an ancient poem about mortality and cosmic struggle. Williams studied Gregorian chants and Eastern liturgical music to create something that sounded religious rather than cinematic. George Lucas asked Williams to score the lightsaber duel as though it were a ceremony with cosmic implications. Editor Paul Martin Smith cut the duel to match the musical rhythm rather than the choreography, letting the score dictate pacing. The visuals serve the music, not the other way around. The duel decides the fate of the galaxy, and the music knows it even if the audience doesn't yet. Number 17. His triumph in destroying the droid control ship impresses politicians and pilots, but not the Jedi Council. Yoda and Mace Windu treat his victory as evidence of dangerous recklessness rather than heroic potential. Samuel L. Jackson said the council scenes were written to show the Jedi as fearful rather than celebratory when confronting raw power. They see Anakin's abilities as a threat to their carefully controlled order. Frank Oz noted that Yoda's reluctance wasn't about Anakin's age or training. It was about fear that the boy represented change the Jedi couldn't control or predict. A chosen one is admitted with reluctance, not pride. The Jedi fear what they cannot understand, and Anakin represents everything they've spent centuries trying to avoid. Number 18. Qui-Gon studies Anakin's confidence, empathy, and protective instincts as much as his Force sensitivity. Liam Neeson said George Lucas told him to play Qui-Gon as someone who values emotional capacity over technical skill. The council focuses only on fear and attachment, treating emotions as weaknesses to eliminate rather than strengths to develop. Frank Oz and Samuel L. Jackson both noted that the council's testing scenes were designed to show institutional blindness to human connection. It reveals two philosophies already drifting apart inside the same Jedi temple. The council believes emotions corrupt judgment and cloud perception. The Jedi lose Anakin not because they trained him poorly, but because they never valued what made him human in the first place. Number 19. Maul versus the Jedi, Gungans versus battle droids, and Anakin versus space combat unfolds simultaneously across 3 battlefields. Editor Paul Martin Smith and George Lucas structured the climax to show political, military, and spiritual conflict happening in parallel. Smith studied battle sequences from war films like Patton and Apocalypse Now to understand how cross-cutting creates thematic unity across separate locations. The Gungans fight a ground war they're losing. The Jedi fight a mystical duel with cosmic implications. Anakin fights a space battle he doesn't understand. Cinematographer David Tattersall used different color palettes for each battlefield to help audiences track locations during rapid cuts. Victory in one arena doesn't translate to victory in another. The galaxy is fragmenting even as characters fight to save it. Number 20. Naboo rejoices with parades and music. The Senate congratulates itself on restoring order. The Jedi Council promotes Ewan McGregor's Obi-Wan to full Jedi Knight status. Meanwhile, Ian McDiarmid as Palpatine wins everything he wanted without revealing his face or admitting his role. George Lucas deliberately structured the ending to feel hollow beneath the celebration. Production designer Gavin Bacay created the victory parade to mirror historical propaganda imagery, beautiful spectacle designed to distract from uncomfortable truths. John Williams scored the finale with triumphant music that feels slightly too grand, almost mocking in its optimism. The Trade Federation is defeated, but the conditions that allowed the invasion remain unchanged. And Sidious controls both sides of the conflict without anyone suspecting. Everyone is just too distracted by parades to notice the darkness spreading beneath the celebration. The Phantom Menace hides its sharpest ideas under chrome starships, Senate speeches, and pod racing engines. Time hasn't softened its warnings. The film only grows louder as the world catches up to what George Lucas buried in plain sight. Political paralysis, institutional blindness, and the quiet rise of authoritarianism through democratic process. Which hidden detail surprised you most, and what film should we open next?